This is Louis Zumbaugh with Rush Hour Ag. Leave your message after the tone.
Hey, Louis, it's Elliott Henderson. Can't wait to tell you about
rolling down the back road, truth riding with the dust, talking agriculture policy with people you can trust. From the field to the Capitol, we're breaking it down. Real talk, real issues from a real farm town. Every hour's rush hour when the work won't wait, so we're cutting through the noise and setting things straight.
What's your rush today, Elliott?
All right, listeners, welcome back to the Rush Hour Ag Podcast. I'm your host, Elliott Henderson.
And I'm your co-host, Louis Zumbaugh. Obviously, if you've been tuned into Rush Hour Ag, you can tell that we're still at our makeshift studio. We still have storm damage, but hopefully in the coming weeks, we'll get that fixed. And hopefully in the coming weeks, we'll get our studio built up and going.
The lights might flicker a few times. It might be a little bit glitchy. And yes, we are still sharing microphones.
Yes. You just can't get close now. You do really like that. So good to know. Anyway, let's quit that.
I'm comfortable with my masculinity, Louis.
Hey, you too. Yeah, no microphone. Anyway, today we got a special guest with us. To Rush Hour Ag. His name's Joe Mitchell. He served in the Iowa House when I was there, and has gone on to do many other things that are really interesting. And I can't even tell you what they all are. So I'm excited to hear from you. And Joe, tell us about yourself and how you ended up where you're at now.
Well, Louis, it's an honor to be here. And I like the makeshift studio, actually. I think it's kind of cozy in here. I'm glad I don't have to share a microphone, by the way. But no, I know.
Test isn't over yet. We might be out.
Right. Well, when Rachel asked me, she reached out and she said, would you be on my dad's, podcast? And I said, of course. Right. And I feel like I have deep ties to your guys' family and, love you and Deb and Rachel and the rest of the family. And we got to know each other from serving in the legislature. And, that was a different time for me because I was 20 when I ran. I was 21 when I got elected. But, ultimately I got involved with, public service and politics, because when I was younger, my parents didn't watch the new CBS, sitcom or ABC. They'd watch Fox News, So, I grew up on Bill O'Reilly and Megyn Kelly and, Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity. And, that really got me interested in politics. And so I wasn't very good at school, but I could get by in government classes, right? And history classes. So I didn't really have to study for those. Math class, science class, English, I had to study a long time to, get a passing grade. C's get degrees was kind of my motto in high school. But, history and government class, I excelled in and was pretty good at. And I had an English teacher who knew I wanted to graduate early from high school. And so she suggested, she was like, you should go be a page at the Iowa Capitol. And so what the page program is like an internship for high school seniors. And so I applied for it. And to my surprise, I got in. They let me in. I don't think there was very many people who applied that year, so I was lucky. So I get up there and, I go up and I was a page and it was a great experience, but really.
Who is your page?
Well, so
the pages are for everybody.
They're for everybody, right?
That's
so
clerk.
So I met everybody, Bacon, he was the best, right? He was always great with the pages and, but Akeo. And I was friends with everyone across the aisle, when I was a page, and it was really a neat experience. And that really sparked my interest then to want to continue to work at the Capitol. And so I applied to Drake University and I got in. Again, not sure how I got in, but I got in and went to Drake. And then I served at the Capitol as a clerk in the state Senate for Bill Anderson. And so I was a clerk for Bill for several years. And then I was an intern in the lobby for about a month. And then my predecessor, Dave Heaton, decided to retire. And so when Dave decided to retire, he'd been there for 24 years. So he'd been there longer than I'd been alive. And, I kind of had this gut feeling in my stomach. It was just like, this might be my time to run. And I was like doing like the calculation in my head, like, well, I'd be 21 by the election. Yeah, I will. And, I went around and I asked a lot of people, I said, should I run for the seat? And most people were encouraging, right? Most people were encouraging. Dave initially wasn't. He said, he was like, maybe you should go back home and get a real job, right? And get a wife and kids, that sort of thing. But against his better judgment, I still decided to run. And, and Dave became one of my biggest mentors and, just recently passed away in the last few months. And he helped me tremendously through, when I was a state rep. But, the primary was like really just myself. And so I was the only one that really believed in myself. And, I had a few buddies that would come out and knock doors and stuff, but really it was just me. And I went around and I told the best advice was go knock doors and go talk to voters. And I had a 4-way primary, and I was the only person to go really knock doors to a large extent. Some people knocked, a few here and there, but, I had the Advantage app and all that sort of thing from the party. And I went around, I knocked on thousands of doors across the district. And ultimately on primary night, and I was ready to not be elected. I was going to call the lady that I thought was going to get elected, that had been backed by the party and by the speaker and stuff. And the election night results come in, and I won by 100 votes. And I was like, what the hell? I didn't know what I was going to do. And so then I, became the nominee, and I was going into my senior year of college, and I already lined up my classes where I could graduate early, because I thought I was going to graduate early. And, because as you can tell, there's a pattern. I don't like school, so I try to get it done with it as soon as possible. But, ultimately got elected in November 2018, graduated college in December of 2018, which I think my parents were more happy about, right? Because they're like, what the hell? You got to graduate from college. You can't run a campaign. And I did it at the same time. And then in January 2019, I got sworn into the Iowa House as the youngest member ever, right? And that's when I first met Louis, right? And I remember coming in, to the chamber, and there was a lot of people that thought I was still an intern, because I still looked like I was about 16 years old. I don't look much older now because I can't grow facial hair like you guys. But, I walked in the chamber, and seriously, man, there were some of these representatives that thought I was still clerking. What are you doing here, Joe? And I said, well, I'm here, I'm your colleague. What? But Louis wasn't one of them. He was very welcoming. And I remember it must have been the first day, I think. I came in and you told me to sit beside you. And that's when you told me to get the cowboy boots, but you had this peanuts or nuts or whatever you always had on your desk. And, I'll never forget that. You just kind of welcomed me as like anybody else. And we sat there and we chatted, and, and that was one of my first friends when I came into the legislature. So, but being a young person coming in that young, I mean, it's hard, because everyone's your parents and grandparents' age, which turned out to be kind of nice, because, you get a lot more, kind of adopted grandparents and parents and people that love you and want to see you succeed and that sort of thing. But, the biggest thing I learned, is when people are under 40, and most of the people elected with us from, 50s, 60s, when you're under 40, you're all kids, you know what I mean? So it doesn't matter if you're 21 or you're 39, you're a kid to people that are over 50. So, I learned that meant, if you did your work and you worked hard and you listened more than you speak, then people respected you. And so, and I've found that out very quickly. And that's why we elected, Speaker Grassley and Matt Winshuttle, who are also young guys, but they got elected when they were my age. So we're 22 years old. So, so it was an incredible experience, getting elected, at 21, and, I'm very glad I did it. There's a good chance at the time that I didn't have, the courage to kind of pull the trigger, but I did. And it worked out, pretty well.
Ignorance of youth.
Ignorance of youth. That's exactly what it was, right? That's exactly what it was. And that's really where, I started this group called Run GenZ. And that started because when I got elected, unlike, a lot of politicians, I feel like when they get elected, they think, oh, look at this great thing I did and how I got elected. And it was because of me, and I'm a great speaker and fundraiser. And I said, I'm not any of those things. So if I can get elected, anybody can get elected. That was my philosophy towards it. And I said, we have to have, more young people that, have a voice and can message. And because I saw AOC, and, he had all these, very young Democrats getting elected from a congressional level, and we didn't have anything to combat that. And you had these groups like Run for Something, Leaders We Deserve, that are ran by, George Soros backed funding. What people, David Hogg, who's, a Democrat, young influencer. And so you had them building these organizations out, and they're recruiting all these young people to run for office. And we didn't have anything like that on our side. And so that's when I started kind of informally mentoring, several young people that were running for office that randomly meet at, Turning Point USA events and Young Republican events. And I said, we can do this on a mass level, and we should be able to do this. And we just need more people like myself that are currently elected to mentor candidates that are running. Because the biggest, barrier to entry to run for race is like when I ran, I didn't know who to talk to. You know what I mean? How do I file my paperwork? I don't know how to do any of that stuff. So if you have a mentor there that is your age that you feel comfortable talking to, they can kind of take that place that a, consultant would typically take, you know what I mean? And you don't have to pay them money. And so, it's almost like a big brothers, big sisters for politics in a way. So that's when, I started the organization. It was pretty much a shell organization for the first few months. And then Governor Terry Branstad came back from China, and Eric, his son, and I met Terry Branstad before, when he was governor. And I was told people I was Governor Branstad's last intern because I wanted to intern the summer 2017 when he left. I wanted to intern before he left. So they let me intern like his last day. And then I always said I was Governor Reynolds' first intern because I was there on her first day. But he comes back from China, and I asked Governor Branstad to be the chairman of the organization. And then he got, John Sununu Sr. from New Hampshire, longtime governor of New Hampshire. His son, Chris, just ended up, 8 years being governor. And he had John Sununu, he had Mary Fallon from Oklahoma. So he had several, Rick Perry, Texas, former governors that joined the advisory board to help promote, this organization and get more young people involved because, Governor Branstad, he ran for office when he was 25. So he was 25 when he first ran, and he was in law school. So very similar type of story, and then ran for, lieutenant governor after that, and then became the youngest governor of the state. So he really resonated with, the mission that we had. So, we started that thing. Charlie Kirk, who runs Turning Point USA, Charlie gave me $30,000 of seed money to start it. Because initially I told Charlie, I said, you should just do this thing and I'll help out with it. He said, I got too many things going on. He said, here's some money. Go grow this and then partner with us to get more young people to run. So that's what we did. And so we started out, there was 4 of us originally in the coalition of some of the youngest state reps from around the country, and then the former governors. And we grew that from 4, people under 30 that were elected to state houses to over 150 now. And ALEC just acquired it last year, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And, they've taken it over now. And, I served on the board initially when they took it over, and they're doing a really great job with it. But now it's on steroids. I mean, they're running school board candidates and city council and state legislative candidates. So it went really well, and really proud of the work, that we did with all that. It was a lot of hard work. And, I raised, several $1 million for the organization over the, 4.5 years that I was involved with that. And never took a paycheck either. I always did real estate development outside of that. But, the biggest thing was we needed the infrastructure, and now we have that. And so anyways, that's where, running at 20 and turned into, starting that organization, and it's worked out really well.
How old are you now?
28.
Okay.
I feel like I'm 45, but I'm 28, right?
So through that, you probably got to know the president.
Yep.
Tell us about your current position and how that all came about.
Right. So, the first time I met the president, which he would never remember, but
I wouldn't be surprised.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know.
Correct.
I've never met him.
Well,
he remembers.
He's got a great memory. In 2015, that was a Page. And, when I was a Page, he came to the Capitol to speak to caucuses, and he was going to the Senate caucus. And so, it was funny because you hear this gossip where he's going to be at when he's coming. Because you got to remember that at that time, he was just a celebrity. You know what I mean? And so he was incredibly popular. I mean, he's probably more popular now, but back then, everyone knew who he was. And so, I was a big fan of the president, from the beginning, and, heard that he was going to be at the Capitol. And so ran over to the Senate side, and I got a selfie with him. And he was mainly taking selfies with the good looking blonde women, and so that I stuck myself in there and got a selfie with him. But so that would have like been the first time that I ever, kind of interacted with him. But then, I got to greet him off Air Force One in 2020 when he came and did the rally in Des Moines in January before COVID. But really, what started for, my journey to work for him was during this last caucus season, every chance I could get that he was in Iowa, I'd, go and see him and supported him, endorsed him in the caucus, which it was a unique time because, he had a primary. I never really thought it was that contested, but some people clearly did, which, for him and his team, if you endorsed him before the caucuses, then, I mean, they remembered that, right? And he was very appreciative of that. And, he called everyone that, endorsed him. And, Shannon Lunger got a call twice, missed both times. I don't know if Shannon's told you that before, but it's kind of a funny story. But he definitely, appreciated everyone in the state that endorsed him, before that caucus. And so this is where, I hosted him at an event that really I had for him at, a Run Gen Z event we had about a week before the caucuses. And I was a caucus captain and all that sort of thing. But so he comes for that reason. And, when he comes in, I was supposed to be talking to him about Run Gen Z, right? That's why he was there. But I just ended up pitching him on, tax credit stuff for real estate because I'm a developer. We can get to that. And that's really how it kind of led to the HUD gig. But, I just immediately pitched him on, this, kind of housing program that I wanted to pitch to him that we've done in Iowa for a long time. And he loved it. I mean, immediately he loved it. And so he's telling this staff, he's like, look at this young guy. He's a developer. He's a good looking guy too, And so I just pitched him on this thing and
mimicking pretty good.
Right. Well, yeah, I've had some practice with it, but so you could just tell though, like right there, he was just like, and he told me, he said, you're going to come to the White House. He was like, you're going to come work for my administration. He was like, we have to have people like you that understand industry. Right. But he was like, more importantly, real estate. But he was like, we have to have people that have, either worked in the fields, worked in the energy sector, been in healthcare that are actually coming to run stuff in Washington because there's too many think tank people. There's too many career political staff that, end up running things and they don't run it very well.
That's all theory, no practice.
All theory, no practice. Right. So he comes to that event. I was a caucus captain and I did some op-eds for him and then I raised money for him. So I was a bundler for him through the election and I raised, several $100,000. And so whenever you raised money for him, then I would be able to go to these events and then speak to him backstage, right? So you'd be on the click line. And typically the click line, it's like 30 seconds long, right? You come in, it's typically with your spouse, right? So you guys get to come in for the photo, he greets you. Again, he loves telling people, like, good looking guy, or how'd you get her? You know what I mean? That sort of thing. Well, for me, because I was like, this, very young person in line who didn't have a spouse and come in and he'd be like, Joe Mitchell, Iowa, and the young people group, right? Yeah, the young people group on Gen Z. And so he would start asking me about Iowa. And so he would just start going down the congressional list and, asking about this person and that person. He was asking about people that, why didn't so-and-so endorse me instead of, who, and you know what I mean? And so, that was probably that was pretty sweet to be able to, interact with them in that way and kind of, give them advice and tell them my take on what's happening in the state. But he'd always end with, I love the people of Iowa. He was like, they've always voted for me. 3 general elections now, the, last few caucuses as well. And, he won overwhelmingly in that caucus by 30 points. And, which I really didn't have any, doubt about that. He asked me before the caucuses, when I had that event for him, he said, well, how's it going to be on caucus night? What's your prediction? And I said, I do think you'll break 50. And I said, the reason for that is it's going to be very cold. And I said, your supporters are more diehard than anybody else. And I said, they'll crawl over glass to come and vote for you. And it turned out to be true. I was like, I just don't see Nikki Haley supporters or DeSantis or whoever, coming out in like the negative, 10-degree weather to come vote on caucus night. I said, I know yours will. And that's what happened. So, anyways, this is where, bundled the money. I was down in Palm Beach on election night and, got to see his speech and all that sort of thing, which was incredible. And no, never forget that. And then, again, working with the people in the campaign, Charlie Kirk, Charlie was a informal advisor to the president, for the presidential personnel office. So Charlie says, you should come down to Palm Beach and volunteer on the PPO team. So I got to go down and work on the PPO team, which hires everyone. And, in the beginning, I mean, they're hiring, like, they're the ones vetting the Secretary of the Army, right? They're the ones, vetting the Deputy Secretary of HHS or, DHS or whatever. And then really clearing these people then for POTUS to, have his interview with and to make sure they're on his team. You know what I mean? Because as we've learned from the first admin, not everyone that says they're a Republican is a Trump Republican. You know what I mean? And people tried to undermine him. And so ultimately got to help out with that screening process, which was, just a different world in itself. You know what I mean? And helping on these different portfolios and, I mean, really high level people. I was like interviewing like general counsels to, certain departments and was going through the resumes and, they were scared shitless of me on the other end of the phone, asking them these questions. And I'm just like, I'm a nobody. I'm a volunteer here, but it was really an incredible experience, being able to work down there. And then ultimately they said, what do you want to do? You've been loyal to the president and you've helped raise a lot of money. And they said, do you want to work, in the White House and do something for PPO or whatever? And I said, honestly, I want to go and help the president with real estate, with, something with HUD or, FHFA, but something that, relates to housing, because that's what I know about. And I don't want to, I don't need to go to the USDA. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not a farmer, right?
So automatically, I'm thinking guy from Iowa. It just doesn't seem like the.
Well, everyone thought, when you talk to people from DC, primarily, they think, well, you should go in USDA because you're Iowa. And I'm like, well, I build homes. I don't, farm corn and beans. So that's when I initially got the job offer to be the chief of staff for the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And so for the first 4 months of the admin, I was in there as the chief of staff to the agency that regulates Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and the federal home loan bank system. And, so we were over, like $8 trillion in mortgages and all this kind of crazy stuff. So it was a pretty uphill learning curve, to say the least. But I mean, it was incredibly interesting. And I learned so much there. In my first week was crazy. I had to fire the chairman of Freddie Mac, the chairman of Fannie Mae. I mean, we cleaned house on the board. Anybody that was a Biden person, we got out of there because we had to make sure we had our people in there. And I had to personally do this to these people. And there was people in the agency I had to let go, and I was in charge of the RIF. So I was in charge of, our entire strategy to, reduce headcount, with the agency. And, and not saying like I had, thoroughly enjoyed those things, but they had to be done.
But isn't that expected when a new
It is.
comes?
Well, but this was different though, because we were, from the Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae side and the leadership changes we made, it was a little unprecedented, but made sense to a certain extent. And then some people at the agency, but these weren't political as typically we were removing. This was part of, kind of the DOGE effort.
Okay.
And because, the DOGE effort they put in place is, there's, primarily Democrat administrations have added so much headcount and personnel, to the tax rolls, to pay people to be government employees and to do certain things and add jobs that were maybe not necessary. And so then each one of the agencies had to have a plan in place, to do a RIF. And so as chief of staff, I was in charge of, that RIF process and getting that started and identifying who we needed and who we didn't need. And there's a lot of, federal law around that you had to be very careful of, right?
What'd you call it? A RIF?
RIF, so reduction in force.
Okay.
So reduction in force. And so you had to essentially identify positions that were no longer needed. It kind of be based on the individuals. And that's just how federal law works. So you had to say, we're going to eliminate this specific position, and it has to be eliminated for, kind of indefinitely, really. And so that's how, in every department we're able to, essentially do the first part of Doge, which was, getting headcount down, because, there's a lot of people in federal government that are employed, they're doing repetitive tasks, they're doing administrative work that, could be done by, one person instead of three. And, the Democrat administrations is, the Biden administration, specifically, they loved adding personnel. You know what I mean? So anyways, that was one of the president's, agenda items coming in. They're still working on, a lot of those. And then there's the deferred resignation program, the DRPs, which are, have been given to people to say you can essentially take early retirement on these sort of things, to get people off, the payroll.
So when those people drop off, are those positions no longer, are they?
They're not refilling them right now.
Okay. But they haven't got those positions off the books yet. But
no. And so they just won't at the moment, they're just not rehiring for those. They could get rid of them, but they're trying to evaluate to make sure. We don't want to get rid of positions that we may legitimately need.
Yep.
And then they're just transferring the work from, somebody that, maybe didn't have as large of a workload and combining that, so, I mean, both FHFA and HUD, there's a staggering amount of pretty much useless paperwork that has to happen. And a lot of this isn't even, these federal employees is like, not necessarily their fault. It's been put in by statute by Congress, and so, Congress hasn't done their job by rolling a lot of the stuff back, and they've punted it to, the, administrative, the executive branch. And so, anyways, this is the first admin in, decades that's ever tried to do anything like this. And it was a much needed change in DC, to be like, just because you have a job on, the federal payroll doesn't mean you're going to have it forever. And then you had to deal with, the coming back to work situation where you had most of these people working remotely for 4 years. So while the rest of us had to be, in the office or out in the field or wherever you, typically worked, if you weren't a federal government employee, these rest of these people were, working remotely for 4 years on like a vacation. So anyways, that was the other, interesting thing about it. But so I, did the chief of staff gig, it was in January that I got picked for that. And then, it was probably end of April, early May, and Secretary Turner called and asked if I would, come to HUD, and was like, I understand if you want to stay in DC, which, I'm not a big DC person, and he said, we have a regional administrator job that's open in, the Midwest. He said, typically they'd be based out of Kansas City, but we can probably, work it out to get you based out of Iowa because there's a HUD office in Des Moines. And he said, what do you think about it? And I said, absolutely. So I thought about it, and it gave me the ability to still work for the administration, but live back here in Iowa, where my friends and family are, and, where my businesses are and that sort of thing. And so I ended up taking the job, and it's different than being a chief of staff of an entire agency. But it's really important work because you're out in the field, you know what I mean? And you're hearing directly from people, what's happening and, the impact that, your agency can potentially have, and HUD does a lot of disaster relief stuff. So, like tomorrow I'm going to Cedar Rapids and I have a round table set up with, Tiffany O'Donnell and, Cedar Rapids lead. I think Brandy's going to come actually to that. And we're going to talk about, the derecho, disaster relief and how that was rolled out, what HUD could do better. A lot of times HUD is, just appropriating the dollars to the state, to Iowa Economic Development Authority or wherever. But, how can we make that process quicker and faster? Because Louis, I'm sure you can attest to, whenever there's a disaster, whether it was 2008 or, the, 2020 derecho, it's always too slow. You know what I mean? And staggeringly slow. And so, that's what has been, really fulfilling and interesting about, the HUD gig is, just trying to get the president's message out. Headquarters is working on some really good things to streamline and, make regulatory more efficient and get some of these arbitrary rules that are put in place that aren't helpful. And, so ultimately it's really how I got, how I ended up here and now ended up on this podcast. But, that's where I am right now.
I think it's a cool story.
It is a cool
Really
story.
fascinated just listening to you talk about it all.
Yeah.
So like HUD and our Iowa local economic development people, I mean, they're hardworking people. I've engaged with them on multiple occasions, but it just seems like the resources available to them just aren't enough to cut the mustard today. And I'm wondering, like, what does your organization do now, or that we should see this improve?
Well, I think the biggest thing is, and when I talk to small communities specifically, they're like, we don't have the support staff to be able to fill out, to get these grants, get, CDBG grants and, other things. And so is there support staff we can put in place? And, I think, that makes sense, with the current system, but ultimately it's like, why is there so many regulations in place where, we're requiring, these small towns to have to hire an entire, new employee to fill out these grants, or have to hire somebody through HUD or whatever it may be. It shouldn't be that hard. You know what I mean? And this is where, like in the state of Iowa, many of the grants that we have, and the, low interest, loan programs and these things, like the average guy like me can access it. You know what I mean? And, that's how things need to be made. Anything that involves a consultant, that and you have to hire a consultant to fill out things to get, money from the government, means that your program's too complicated. And so this is where I think, the secretary and the president's goal is, they're working to, deregulate and, make, the red tape and, the compliance not, nearly as extensive, and still have accountability there. I mean, there's again, I use Iowa because we do such a great job. We do so many programs through state funded, through IDA, and almost never do you have to hire a consultant. I mean, some people do for it because they save time or whatever, but we make it simple. And why can't the federal government run like that? So that's what the feedback I'm getting back from people is, and we're sending up to headquarters. And again, there's going to be some, announcements come out in the next few months about, community development block grants and, other things that HUD does, to make it more simplified and, streamlined and more efficient. But, I think that's the difference between the current administration and the last administration is, this administration thinks about how can we make things easier for people, not harder. And when you don't have, DC people that you're listening to 24/7 that, want to regulate every single, nook and cranny that you have, it makes it a lot easier to do business and get things done.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you were saying that in a development about 20%.
Okay, so well, now we're getting to the workforce housing tax credits.
Yep.
Which I knew Louis wanted to get to and debate me on this. No, I'm just kidding. Which Louis voted on multiple times when he was in the legislature, because it would have been in, probably been in, what are the, budget bills that would have for IDA. But so what I've done for the past 5 years, everything I've really told you guys about until the federal government gig was all volunteer. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Besides
Until
this
the HUD deal.
Well, yeah, I said until the federal government. Yeah.
Yep.
In the state legislature, you're paid, but it still feels like it's, you're a super volunteer. So, since 2020, I've been doing these workforce housing developments, and I have, several partners that I do it with. But, what the workforce housing tax credit is, it's a state tax credit through the state of Iowa. We've had it since 2014. It was passed by Governor Branstad, and this was kind of, his initial idea. And the reason for it is way back in 2014, right, we don't have enough housing for the average person, for workforce families. And there's a lot of programs out there, including through the federal government, like the LIHTC, the low income housing tax credit, builds multifamily housing, for, very low income, 50%, 30%, 80% AMI type of families, average median income. And so Governor Branstad and his staff said was, we don't have anything again for like the average workforce family, in small towns around the state. And so, this is where, and initially, the credit program, it wasn't very competitive because no one really knew about it. And building homes was a lot easier 10 years ago than it is now with cost of inflation and stuff. And it gradually became a competitive application program. But how it works is, me as a developer, I'll identify a piece of property that I want to develop on. I'll own the land free and clear. I'll have an option on it, but I'll apply through the Iowa Economic Development Authority for the tax credit. Okay. And, ultimately what the tax credit equates to is you can have 20% of your construction cost, your hard cost, that is covered up to $1 million. And that doesn't include soft costs like engineering costs, attorney fees, architecture, that sort of thing. But your hard costs and your construction costs, that's covered.
Water, sewer?
Water, sewer is not covered. It's everything really vertical.
Okay.
Everything
Just
foundation and
actual
vertical,
building.
actual building. Yes, correct. So, it covers 20% of your hard costs on these projects for rural communities. So that'd be your 89 least populous counties in the state of Iowa. Your 10 most populous can only get 10%. Unless you're a small city set aside, which is...
Did they just change that?
Well, so this is what the small city set aside is if you're a 2,500 person community or less, then you can access the 20%.
2,500 or less.
Yes. Yep. For the population. So ultimately you apply for this credit and they want to know, is your financing in place? Where's your renderings? Do you have letters of support from the community? Is there anticipated job growth over the next, 3 years? And then they competitively score it. You get 2 points, if your financing is in place. You get 2 points if, the property is a, gray field or brownfield property, so on and so forth. And then if you get the credit, like I said, it's the 20% or the 10%, up to that $1 million. But then, ultimately you can build single family with it. You can build multifamily, you can build, townhomes with it. And then once you get your certificate of occupancy, you get your credit, and the credit is typically used as a bridge loan. And so when I get the initial agreement from IDA, I can then go sell that credit, for 90 cents on the dollar, call it. And then I can use that purchase agreement as a bridge loan with the bank to help with the collateral. So why this is important is because you look at a place like Mount Pleasant, Iowa, where I'm from, where I've done 2 projects so far. And if I didn't have the credit, I wouldn't have done either one of those projects. Both of those projects, you hadn't seen a condo or a townhome project, much less single family, done in almost 30 years. You see that in most of these communities. And that's because the capital stack doesn't work. And so, when you look at my pro forma and I have a 1.2, debt coverage ratio, which, freaks banks out, right? Because they're like, you have, 1 or 2 bad months of people being vacant, it's hard to cash flow the thing. But even with the credit, that's how thin it is, because, when your average median income is so much less in Mount Pleasant than it would be in Marion, Iowa, you have to have, that tax incentive in there. And whether it's coming from the state or you have on the local level, you have TIF, right? You have tax abatements, those sort of things, which almost all my projects, I have, local and state, incentives that are involved with it, because that's what allows me to get a bank loan, right? That's what allows confidence in a project for me to actually cash flow the thing. So, because you don't do it for free, you know what I mean? It's still a job, and I still have a personal guarantee on the loan. And so when you look at what we've done in Iowa with workforce housing, and I was just up in Cherokee, Iowa and Spencer, Iowa last week, and they had those devastating floods that happened. Mm-hmm. And all the new housing projects they have happening are all because of the workforce housing tax credit that went in. And if they didn't have that, they were like, we'd never do it. We'd never be able to do it. And so I go around to these other states that are similar to ours, right? Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, which I represent as the HUD regional administrator, all those places.
Any others?
No, just those 4. Yep. And so you go around and they're desperately waiting for something like this. And you see, I go to these towns, you go to Hannibal, Missouri, for instance. I was just there a few weeks ago. And they're just like Mount Pleasant. They're just like Grinnell. They're just like Dyersville, these places that I'm, building or have built in where there's no new housing, right? And there's the single family homes that'll go up because, the attorneys, the bankers, if you're a wealthy enough farmer, right? You can afford to build the new home, right? But
Condos seem to be really popular in Independence. Like there are
right,
small condos, like small retirement type community,
right,
blowing up.
Yeah, and that's what primarily. If you look at my projects, they're almost all townhomes. A lot of them are zero entry, no stairs, because I want older people to downsize and then open up their single family homes for working class families.
Put inventory back in.
But everything with the housing crisis right now is a supply issue. The supply issue, and so you need as many homes built as possible. And I would argue, kind of that missing middle is where you need to have the most homes at, because when you build them in that missing middle, then people in those older, apartment units will move up to a townhome. Those people in the townhome then move up to a single family home. The people that were in the single family home then go back down to a zero entry condo, right? But what we have an issue with right now is we think too small, and we put these programs in place to help, rehab, your home here or there, and it fixes up one or two homes in a community. And it's like, we're millions and millions of units short on housing. And the only way to be able to fix that is to have the right incentives, but also deregulation. And this is where, I bang my head up against a wall, talking to people on both sides of the aisle, because my Republican friends never think that we need incentives for development, right? And my Democrat friends never think we need deregulation. And actually you need, radical incentives and deregulation to make it work, to get as many housing units as you need to have to bring costs down. Because right now, with all my rental properties, I'm 100% occupied. I'm not competing with anybody. And, like when Iowa Westland shut down in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, a few years ago, I was worried for the other landlords that had, apartments and, townhomes and stuff around the campus, because I was like, they're going to be totally screwed, right? Whereas they're, you're having 500 students sleep now, and they're all fully occupied because there's such a shortage of housing. And so, like any other industry, you have to create competition, and you're not going to do that unless you have an abundance of homes that are built very soon. The interest rates aren't helping, but then New York and California and these places, the regulation's too much. I mean, it's staggering, and they put all these energy code things in, and because again, if you look at the building code from 2012, or you can go back to 2000 or 1990, it's really not that unsafe. You know what I mean? It's not really an unsafe building code. Same with the energy efficiency code. And I tell people this all the time. I grew up in a home that was built in 1920, and it had been remodeled,
Lost all lights.
right. But it'd been remodeled since then, obviously. But like, the egress window, right, and the installation that we have there, and the amount of stairs we had to have and stairwell, that hadn't changed. And my parents didn't feel like it was unsafe for me to live there. Most people are living in houses that are 75 to 100 years old. I mean, it's the average age of our housing stock. So this is where we've continued to add regulation on, and it's increased cost. People have been incredibly critical of incentives that are there for developers, but we have to make it work somehow financially. And so this is where there needs to be a mindset change. And I actually think we do a really good job in Iowa, and that's why we've had when you look at the data, we're doing far better than everyone else on housing units in general, and that's because of things like the workforce housing tax credit program. So that's why I pitched the president on. When he came to my event, he loved it because he understood it, because, the president knows real estate better than anybody else in the world. But his family, they made a lot of their money initially, his dad, Fred, on affordable housing units. So he understands this and how it works, and, the incentives that you have to give to people to build stuff that's, for working class people, or, affordable homes, and not just, custom made, 4,000 or 5,000 square foot homes for wealthy people, So So it's interesting. And I think a lot of the ideas I just said are, things that the administration, the secretary and the president, are looking at or taking up and understand, and
So as you're talking about this, it's got me thinking about some of the issues happening in these small towns right now is that there's just not enough cash flow to satisfy the services.
Yep.
They need more new homes. They need
Right.
higher a tax base in these communities.
Right.
And it's just not happening because we can't develop.
Well, and this is where, I would say the one thing, in Iowa that, didn't go the right direction, which 3 years ago when they passed that property tax bill, which I haven't seen my property taxes go down, but when they passed that bill, one of the things they did in it was they took out the school levy portion of, on an abatement from not being able to abate the school levy portion of your taxes if you're going to get an abatement for development. And what that does is in a place like, Central City, right? Or Mount Pleasant or Grinnell, that's about 40% of my tax base. And so now my abatement is worth about half as much as it was before. And, when you're abating a piece of property, these city councils are abating pieces of property that aren't producing any taxes. So you're already not getting any taxes. The abatement is to say, okay, if you build something, we want to incentivize you to build. So then in 5 or 10 years, we actually get all that tax revenue then. There's something nice and new there and it produces a lot of tax revenue. And so they changed the law. So the school levy can now no longer be counted towards that abatement. And in Des Moines, only 10% of your property taxes go towards the school levy, right? So my developer friends in Des Moines, they don't really care about that. It doesn't really affect them. And they get a lot of TIF too, because they do a lot of mixed use, which we use for TIF for the economic development carve out they have. So this is like, we're passing this tax law. It's already hard enough to build in rural Iowa. And again, abatements, you're building on places that aren't producing tax revenue anyways for these cities. And now we just, cut their knees out from under them. And we're going to say your abatement's worth half as much as it was before, so that's an issue. And, these are some, unintended consequences that you look at, because when the Department of Revenue looks at it, they say, well, here's all the lost revenue from not getting, the money from the school taxes when you do this abatement. But it's like, but I'm not going to build there unless I get the abatement. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we're talking about $2,000 in taxes versus potentially $2 million
Right,
in taxes.
right.
It's different.
Correct. And so it's like they try to play the chicken before the egg scenario, and it just doesn't work. And, but this is why, like, it. You have to have people in your field that are advocating and educating legislators. Because I had to lean on people like yourself on anything that was agriculture, because I'm not a farmer and I'm not going to act like I'm a farmer. Now, some legislators, they act like, they're everything in every field, and they'll stand up a caucus and, it's like, you're in insurance, but you're, talking about, trucking right now, you know what I mean? This is what happens. And so, ultimately, I would like for that to be reversed, because frankly, I haven't, and right now is my role at HUD. I can't manage any projects or anything. I can just be investors in my projects, but I haven't told my partners to go after anything else in rural Iowa because of that, reason. And, then the bank, frankly, probably won't loan us money if, that tax abatement was a big thing that we could do a lot of these projects. So, that's just the practical reality of it, what happens.
So how does your group decide on where they're going to build? And is Dyersville's in 2 counties, correct? Dubuque
Yeah,
and
they're
Delaware?
in Delaware and
So
Dubuque.
yours would be in Delaware County, I take it. You would only get 10%.
Well, no. So because they're in Delaware and Dubuque, they get to be counted as the smaller city.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just, when you mentioned them figures, I knew you had the one in Dubuque.
Right. No, so we're still doing Dyersville. But all those projects we lined up before the abatement change.
Right. But how did you decide on those towns?
So I would just say, well, and this is where, Dyersville is a unique small town. There's a lot of stuff happening there, as with the Field of Dreams, but also like Dubuque is just
Stone's throw away.
it's just stone's throw away, and it's a booming community. Like not every river town like Dubuque is doing so well, And Dubuque, I think very highly of. I think they're doing a great job. And so, I mean, there's just a lot of stuff happening in Dyersville, and industry is growing and people want to move there. They have a shortage of housing. And so, from a business standpoint, we know going to Dyersville, we're going to lease up townhomes immediately because people want them. Mount Pleasant, because I'm from Mount Pleasant, so that's why we ultimately built there. I had the relationships with, the city, and, I knew that I would have the connections to get stuff filled, and, people know me there. So, Grinnell, I mean, that was another place where we worked with the city a lot. And I think Grinnell's a good community, and I think they're growing. They're, close-ish to Des Moines, and you see more and more people moving out of Des Moines proper, and, they want to live in places that are within, driving distance to, Altoona or wherever that may be. Clear Lake, we're doing a project in Clear Lake, and Clear Lake's a similar community to a Dyersville.
Okay.
Where they're unique, and they have, kind of the lake life, and people want to move there. And
Ballroom.
it's Surf Ballroom, right? Surf Ballroom, ZZ Top. They were there last year when I was there. So they get, some pretty,
It's only ZZ now, or Z now.
right. It's like Z, right. They lost one of the Z's. Yeah. So like Clear Lake, it's another place. It's unique, and it's, by Mason City. So it's got that, kind of population center there, similar to like a Dyersville to Dubuque. So anyways, we go around and we figure out who wants us there too. Sure. I'm not going to build in the city that doesn't want us there. So that's always typically the first conversation is talk to the mayor, talk to the city manager, talk to the economic development people, and, see if, they want to welcome you or not.
Sure. Well, we obviously have a limited amount of time that we can discuss things. I want to thank you for coming out. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure.
I guess I seen you.
It's been fun.
Hey, I seen you at the Trump rally.
Yeah, the Trump rally. Yeah,
but that was the first time I'd seen you in probably a year.
Right.
A little longer.
Right.
It was great to do that. And
Call to action. You got any words that you'd like to put out to listeners?
Well, it depends what it is. I mean, if there's any young people listening, they can go to, rungenz.com.
Okay.
If you're thinking about running for office. From, I guess I'll put my political hat on with this, but we got to win the midterms.
Sure.
And we got to have people like, Ashley Henson and, Joni Ernst that are reelected, whoever our governor candidate's going to be. So we got to make sure to go out there and, support our, Republican candidates, and, make sure we continue to drive, President Trump's agenda, because there's only so much you can do administratively, and that can all be, reversed, when the next, president comes in. So we got to make sure to get some more stuff done in Congress, and that doesn't happen if we don't have a Congress, right? So I would just say, support, your local folks, your federal folks, your state folks. And, if any communities have questions about, HUD questions, they can email me. My email is joseph.p.mitchell@hud.gov. And yeah, it's been fun. I'm glad you guys had me on.
Well, it sounds to me like if Jeff Kaufman ever wants to retire the head of the Republican Party, you might be in contention to take that over.
I don't know about that. I don't know. That'd be big shoes to fill. Jeff's he's done a great job, and he's much louder than I am. So
you're getting there though.
Right.
Anyway, thanks for coming out to the farm today. I hope our next podcast, we have lighting and some new mics, but thanks for joining in, and rush right on back. Thank you.